I was 30 minutes late to my own humiliation. By the time I reached the restaurant, my parents had already finished dessert. Empty plates cluttered the table like evidence after a crime. Scene. Steak knives smeared with sauce, crumpled napkins, half-melted ice in abandoned glasses. My father leaned back in his chair, rubbing his stomach with satisfaction when he saw me approaching. "Oh, you're finally here," he said with a grin that felt rehearsed. "You can pay the bill, right?" My sister snorted into her wine glass. She still has no idea. The laughter around the table wasn't loud. That somehow made it worse. Quiet cruelty always cuts deeper. I stopped beside the table, still holding my car keys in one hand. For a second, nobody offered me a seat. Nobody apologized for starting without me. My mother avoided eye contact entirely, pretending to organize receipts in her purse, while the golden anniversary centerpiece flickered between us. That's when I understood. The invitation had never been about celebrating together. They had waited until the dinner was over to call me because they needed someone to cover a $4,000 bill. Again, the same daughter they ignored at holidays, the same daughter they mocked for working too much, the same daughter they only remembered whenever money became involved. Around us, the restaurant glowed with soft amber lighting and piano music. Waiters moved quietly between tables. Somewhere behind me, dishes clinked in the kitchen. My father slid the leather check folder toward me without shame. And that was the moment I finally decided they would never use me again. I looked at the bill once, then calmly raised my hand toward the floor manager walking nearby. The second he recognized me, his expression changed instantly. And across the table, my family's smiles disappeared. I wasn't the successful one in my family story. At least not publicly. That title belonged to my younger sister, Ava, the charming one with perfect makeup, a loud laugh, and a talent for making irresponsibility look glamorous. My parents adored her because she reflected the version of success they understood. Visible, effortless, attention-grabbing. I was quieter, methodical. The daughter who solved problems. Before anyone noticed they existed, for years that made me useful instead of valued. When Dad forgot mortgage payments, I wired money without discussion. When Mom's medical insurance lapsed, I spent 3 nights fixing paperwork while balancing conference calls for my own company. Every family emergency somehow ended, with my card on the table and my name absent from the gratitude afterward. Eventually, I stopped expecting appreciation. What hurt wasn't the money, it was the assumption that I would always say yes. The truth none of them respected was that I had built my life from nothing. At 24, I worked double shifts while finishing graduate school online. By 32, I owned a boutique hospitality consulting firm that quietly managed financial recovery strategies for luxury restaurants and hotels across the city. Ironically, one of those restaurants was the very one my parents had chosen for their anniversary dinner. They didn't know that, because they never asked enough questions about my life to find out. A waiter finally pulled out a chair for me, after an awkward silence stretched across the table. The cushion was still warm from whoever had been sitting there before me. No one mentioned it. "We already ordered everything," my mother said lightly, smoothing the sleeve of her designer jacket. "You're always late anyway." I had arrived 8 minutes after the reservation time. My sister swirled the last sip of wine in her glass and smiled without looking at me. "You should have seen the seafood tower. Dad said it would have been wasted on someone who's always working." They laughed softly together, the kind of practiced family laughter that automatically excluded one person from the room. I noticed the details then. The extra bottles of champagne stacked beside the table. The expensive reserve label whiskey my father never bought with his own money. The unopened dessert menu sitting near my plate like a prop. They had planned this carefully. Dad tapped the black leather bill folder with 2 fingers. "Consider it your contribution to the celebration." Contribution. Not invitation, not gift, not gratitude. My chest tightened, but years of experience kept my expression calm. Families like mine depended on visible reactions. If you showed hurt, they treated it like weakness. So I stayed quiet and let them keep talking. That was when my sister leaned closer and muttered, just loud enough for me to hear, "At least she's useful for something." And suddenly, the entire evening became very clear. I stared at the bill for a long moment without touching it. $4,218. Private wine pairings, imported seafood, a bottle of champagne that cost more than my first monthly rent after college. My father leaned back confidently, already certain the problem had been solved the second I walked through the door. My mother kept checking her phone to avoid the discomfort of looking at me directly. Ava smiled into her reflection in the dark restaurant window, completely unbothered. and something inside me finally went still. Not angry, not emotional, just finished. I realized then that this had never been accidental behavior. They weren't careless with me. They were comfortable using me. Every ignored birthday, every forgotten invitation, every emergency that magically appeared near payday had built toward this exact moment. They believed I would absorb humiliation quietly because I always had before. The difference was that tonight, I no longer needed their approval enough to tolerate it. So instead of reaching for my wallet, I raised my hand calmly toward the restaurant manager near the bar. He noticed me immediately. The moment he walked over, his posture straightened with recognition. "Good evening, Ms. Laurent," he said warmly. "We weren't expecting you tonight." Across the table, the color drained from my father's face, because suddenly they understood something they should have learned years ago. I wasn't the desperate daughter trying to earn a seat at their table anymore. I was the person who owned part of the building they were sitting in. The silence that followed was almost elegant. My sister lowered her wineglass first. My father sat forward slowly, his earlier confidence collapsing beneath visible calculation. He was replaying every joke, every dismissive comment, trying to figure out how much the manager had heard. I didn't help him. The manager remained beside me, professional and composed. "Would you like me to handle this privately?" he asked. I gave a small nod. That single exchange changed the balance of the entire table. For the first time in years, my family understood there were parts of my life they had never bothered to learn about. 3 years earlier, when the restaurant had nearly gone bankrupt during an ownership transition, my firm stepped in quietly. I negotiated supplier contracts, stabilized staffing, and invested enough capital to secure a minority partnership stake in return. I never mentioned it to my parents, because conversations with them were transactional by nature. Success only interested them if it could be borrowed, shown off, or exploited. The manager opened the bill folder carefully. "There's also the issue of the private reservation agreement," he said, directing the comment toward my father now. "The account attached to tonight's event declined twice earlier this evening." Dad blinked. "What?" I already knew, because 20 minutes before arriving, I had reviewed the reservation notes through the restaurant system after receiving Ava's suspicious last-minute invitation. Something about her overly cheerful tone had warned me this wasn't a family dinner, so while driving there I prepared quietly, just in case I finally needed to stop being useful. The manager spoke carefully, but every word landed like glass settling onto a table. "The reservation was made under a premium anniversary package," he explained. "Payment authorization was required in advance. Since the card failed, the balance remains outstanding." My father looked at me automatically, instinctively expecting rescue. I held his gaze and said nothing. Around us, the restaurant continued normally, soft piano music drifting through the room, waiters carrying silver trays beneath amber lighting, conversations humming from distant tables. But at ours, the atmosphere had hardened into something cold and painfully exposed. Ava forced a laugh first. "Okay, this is getting dramatic. Can we just put it on your account and deal with it later?" "My account? Not my name, not me. Just another resource." The manager waited politely for my response. I could feel my mother watching me now, finally attentive after years of indifference. I folded my hands calmly on the table. "No," I said. "Separate me from the reservation entirely." The words were quiet enough that nearby tables never noticed, but my father's expression shifted instantly, from embarrassment to panic. "Hold on," he snapped under his breath. "You're seriously leaving us with this?" "Leaving them with what?" "Their own choices." The manager nodded once and removed my name from the event file on his tablet. Just a few taps, clinical final. And suddenly, for the first time in my life, my family had to face consequences without me standing between them and reality. My father's voice lost its authority almost immediately after that. He stopped sounding like the man who had mocked me minutes earlier and started sounding older, smaller, someone cornered by his own assumptions. He argued quietly with the manager about payment plans while avoiding eye contact with nearby tables. My mother's face had gone pale with humiliation, not because of the bill itself, but because other people were beginning to notice the tension. Ava looked stunned most of all, not angry, confused, as if it had genuinely never occurred to her that I could refuse. That realization hurt more than the dinner ever did, because families teach you your value long before the world does. Mine had trained me to believe love was earned through usefulness. If I fixed problems, paid quietly, stayed agreeable, I could remain included. Barely. The moment I stopped serving a purpose, the affection disappeared with it. Sitting there, watching them scramble without me, I understood why the night mattered. It wasn't revenge for one expensive dinner. It was the first boundary I had ever enforced without apologizing for it afterward. The consequences reached beyond money. Something permanent cracked at that table. The illusion that I existed to absorb everyone else's consequences. And once people realize they can no longer control you through guilt, they often reveal who they really are when the control stops working. I left the restaurant alone that night. The city air felt cooler than before, sharp against my skin as I stepped onto the quiet sidewalk. Behind me, warm light spilled through the restaurant. Windows where my family was still sitting at that table, forced for once to solve their own disaster without me cushioning the fall. My phone buzzed twice before I reached my car. One message from Ava. "You embarrassed Dad." Another from my mother. "I hope you're happy." I read both, then locked the screen without replying, because for the first time, happiness wasn't the point. Peace was. Over the following months, the silence between us stretched naturally. Fewer calls, fewer emergencies, fewer manipulative invitations disguised as family obligations. And strangely, the distance didn't feel lonely. It felt honest. I started spending holidays with people who spoke to me with respect instead of expectation. I traveled more, slept better, laughed easier. The constant exhaustion I had carried for years slowly disappeared once I stopped financing relationships that only survived on my sacrifice. What I learned is this: some people will only love the version of you that makes their lives easier. But the moment you stop abandoning yourself to keep others comfortable, you finally meet the person you were supposed to become. And that night, walking away from that dinner table, I realized freedom can sound a lot like silence.